It started like any other day, with the sun shining bright over Placerville High School. The morning air was warm, peaceful, and normal. Charlie Decker sat in his usual seat, staring out of the window as Mrs. Underwood lectured on algebra. But inside, Charlie wasn't feeling normal. He was distracted, his thoughts racing. For weeks, a heavy feeling had been building inside him, a feeling of disconnection from the world, as though everyone else was part of something he couldn't touch. His classmates, their voices, their movements, they all seemed distant, like actors in a play that he had never been cast in. And now, today, that invisible wall between him and the world felt stronger than ever. The intercom buzzed loudly, jolting Charlie from his thoughts. "Charlie Decker, please report to the office." Mrs. Underwood paused, giving him a quick glance before nodding her approval for him to leave. Without a word, Charlie stood, his movements calm and deliberate. He knew what was waiting for him in the office: another lecture, another meaningless conversation. But today, Charlie didn't feel like playing along. Instead of heading straight to the office, Charlie made his way to the restroom. The empty hallway echoed with his footsteps. Each step felt heavy, each breath more deliberate. In the restroom, he splashed cold water on his face, staring at his reflection in the mirror. His dark, tired eyes stared back. Today, something was different. The weight inside him felt like it had finally reached its breaking point. Charlie walked back out, not toward the office, but back to his classroom. He wasn't sure what he was going to do, but he knew he needed to do something that would make them all stop, look, and finally see him. As Charlie re-entered the classroom, the air felt thicker, the atmosphere more tense. Mrs. Underwood continued her lesson, unaware of the change in Charlie's demeanor. His classmates were engrossed in their own worlds, some taking notes, others doodling in their notebooks. No one noticed him, not yet. Charlie quietly returned to his seat, but his mind wasn't on algebra. It was racing, searching for something. He looked around the room, his eyes landing on each classmate, wondering if any of them really knew him, really saw him. "Why does nobody care?" he thought to himself. "Why does no one ever ask how I'm doing?" The restlessness inside him grew. He stood up again, slowly this time. Mrs. Underwood noticed. "Charlie, is something wrong?" she asked, her voice soft but cautious. Charlie didn't answer. He walked toward the front of the classroom, his steps deliberate, his mind focused on what came next. The classroom fell into an uneasy silence as Charlie stood in front of the board. He picked up a piece of chalk and began writing, large and clear, the word "why." He turned to face the class, who now sat still, watching him. His eyes swept over them, faces filled with curiosity, confusion, and a hint of fear. "Why does everything have to be this way?" Charlie asked, his voice steady but filled with frustration. "Why do people like you get to live in your little bubble, while people like me get ignored? What makes you so special?" The students exchanged nervous glances. Nobody had an answer. Claire Thompson, sitting near the back, was the first to raise her hand, her fingers trembling slightly. "Charlie, what's going on?" she asked softly. "What are you trying to say?" Charlie's gaze shifted to Claire. "What do I want? I want someone to finally listen. I want someone to care enough to ask why things are the way they are." Claire's brow furrowed in concern. She had known Charlie for years, but this side of him was unfamiliar. He wasn't the angry outcast, people often thought he was. He was someone who felt deeply, someone who wanted more from the world, but didn't know how to ask for it. "I'm listening, Charlie," Claire said, her voice calm. "We're all listening." Charlie shook his head, pacing slightly in front of the class. "No, you don't get it. You don't understand what it's like to be invisible. To be trapped in this place, day after day, feeling like nobody cares if you're even here." He looked out the window, the peaceful world outside feeling miles away. Inside, the classroom was thick with tension. Everyone was on edge, but no one moved. They were all waiting for what would happen next. The phone on Mrs. Underwood's desk rang suddenly, breaking the heavy silence. Everyone jumped, their eyes darting toward the noise. Charlie tensed, his hand twitching slightly. Mrs. Underwood reached for the phone but hesitated. Charlie's gaze was locked on her, his expression unreadable. "Answer it," he said quietly, his voice low but firm. Mrs. Underwood picked up the receiver, her voice shaky as she answered. After a moment, she glanced at Charlie, her face pale. "It's the principal's office. They want to speak with you." Charlie stood still, his eyes narrowing. "Tell them I'm not coming." Mrs. Underwood relayed the message, her hand trembling slightly as she hung up the phone. The room was quiet again, the tension building once more. Claire, sensing that things were about to escalate, slowly stood from her seat. "Charlie, listen," she said gently, taking a cautious step forward. "It doesn't have to be this way. You don't have to do this. We can figure it out together." Charlie's eyes softened slightly as he looked at her. For a moment, the anger and frustration seemed to fade. He took a deep breath, his hands loosening at his sides. "Maybe," he muttered, glancing around the room. "Maybe you're right." Claire took another step toward him, her voice calm and steady. "Let's just talk, Charlie. You don't have to prove anything to anyone." The room seemed to breathe again as Charlie's posture relaxed. The students, still seated, watched anxiously, but the fear in their eyes had lessened. Claire had managed to reach him, at least for now. Charlie turned back to the chalkboard, staring at the word he had written. "Why? I just wanted someone to listen," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire nodded. "We're listening now, Charlie. We're here." For the first time in what felt like forever, Charlie stood still, his mind quiet. The word "why" still loomed large on the board behind him, but its meaning no longer felt so elusive. He had everyone's attention now, real attention, not the kind that brushed off his questions or ignored his pain. Claire stood close, her calm presence like a tether keeping him grounded. "We're all in this together, Charlie," she said, her voice low but strong. "We've all had moments where we felt lost, like nobody could hear us, but this isn't how we solve it." Charlie's shoulders slumped slightly as her words sank in. He had spent so long building walls around himself, convinced that no one would understand. Yet here was Claire, standing in front of him, offering something he hadn't expected, compassion. The rest of the students remained frozen in their seats, their eyes darting between Claire and Charlie. Some were still nervous, unsure of how things would unfold. Others seemed to relax just a little, sensing that the worst might be over. David, who usually cracked jokes in class, was uncharacteristically quiet. He exchanged a glance with Sarah, who sat beside him, her eyes wide with concern. They had never seen Charlie like this before, so raw, so exposed. Mrs. Underwood, who had been silent, during the tense exchange, stepped forward cautiously. "Charlie," she said, her voice soft, "I think we should call someone who can help you." Charlie looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I don't need help," he muttered. "I just need people to listen." Before anyone could respond, the phone rang once more, shattering the delicate silence that had settled over the room. This time, Mrs. Underwood didn't hesitate. She answered it quickly, her face paling as she listened. "It's the principal's office again," she said after a moment. "They're asking if everything is okay." Claire stepped forward before Charlie could respond. "Tell them we're fine," she said, her voice steady. "Everything's under control." Mrs. Underwood hesitated, but did as Claire instructed. When she hung up, the tension in the room seemed to lift, if only slightly. Charlie's breathing slowed as he listened to Claire's words. He hadn't expected her to stand up for him, but now that she had, something inside him shifted. Maybe, just maybe, she was right. Maybe there was another way out of this. "You don't get it," Charlie finally said, his voice quiet but clear. "I've been feeling like this for a long time. Like I'm invisible. Like no one really cares what happens to me." Claire took another step closer. "We care, Charlie. I care. And I'm sorry if it felt like no one was listening before. But we're listening now." Charlie's eyes flickered with uncertainty. He glanced around the room, seeing his classmates watching him intently. For the first time, they didn't look at him with judgment or fear. They looked at him with concern, maybe even understanding. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air as Charlie stood at the front of the class, unsure of what to do next. His initial plan, whatever it had been, seemed to dissolve in the face of the genuine compassion being offered to him. Claire's words echoed in his mind. "We're listening now." He glanced back at the chalkboard, the word "why" glaring back at him. He had written it in frustration, desperate to make sense of everything that had been building inside him. But now he wasn't so sure if he needed an answer anymore. Maybe the question itself had been the answer all along. "Maybe you're right," Charlie muttered, almost to himself. Maybe there's still time." The room felt lighter, as though a dark cloud had begun to lift. Claire nodded slowly, offering Charlie a small but encouraging smile. "There's always time, Charlie. It's not too late." Charlie exhaled deeply, the tension in his body finally easing. He felt tired, more tired than he had in a long time. But there was also a strange sense of relief. He didn't need to carry the weight of his pain alone anymore. There were people who cared, even if he hadn't seen it before. Mrs. Underwood, who had been watching the exchange closely, stepped forward again. "Charlie," she said softly, "we can get you help, real help. You don't have to go through this alone." Charlie glanced at her, then back at Claire, before finally nodding. "Okay," he whispered. "Maybe I do need help." The tension that had once suffocated the room seemed to dissipate as Charlie sat down at his desk, his head in his hands. Claire returned to her seat as well, her heart pounding with adrenaline, but filled with hope. The rest of the class remained quiet, but there was a collective sigh of relief. Things had changed, and they all knew it. What could have spiraled into something far worse had instead become a moment of connection, a moment of understanding. As the school bell rang, signaling the end of the period, Mrs. Underwood glanced at the clock, her face still pale but composed. "Class dismissed," she said softly, her voice steady once more. The students began to gather their things, moving quietly as they left the room. But the weight of what had just happened lingered with them. They had seen a side of Charlie they never knew existed, and it had changed the way they saw him, and perhaps each other, forever. As the students filed out of the room, Charlie remained seated, his thoughts racing but calmer now. Claire lingered for a moment, watching him from the door. She wanted to say something that would reassure him, but words felt inadequate. Instead, she gave him a small nod, a silent promise that he wasn't alone. Charlie watched her go, his mind filled with uncertainty, but also with the faintest glimmer of hope. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel invisible. He didn't feel forgotten. And that, he realized, was enough for now.